October 4th, 2020. A Stanford professor with an MD and a PhD in economics published 900 words that his own government wanted erased. His name was Jay Bhattacharya. He'd spent 20 years studying what makes people sick and what makes health policy work. He wasn't a fringe figure. He was a published researcher at one of the most respected medical schools on Earth. And on that October morning, along with colleagues from Harvard and Oxford, he published an open letter arguing that blanket COVID lockdowns were causing harm that nobody in Washington wanted to measure. Within days, the director of the National Institutes of Health, the man who ran the largest funder of medical research in the world, privately emailed Anthony Fauci asking for, and I'm quoting here, a quick and devastating published takedown of Bhattacharya and his co-authors. Twitter shadow banned him. Facebook removed his videos. A dozen federal agencies pressured social media companies to suppress his work. Stanford's department chair blocked his seminars. The institution that was supposed to fund science tried to bury a scientist. That was October 2020. Fast forward to March 25th, 2025. The United States Senate confirms Jay Bhattacharya as the director of the National Institutes of Health. 53-47, party line vote. The man the NIH tried to destroy walked into the building. And then, just 14 months later, a Democrat senator sat across from him in a hearing room and asked him a question he couldn't answer. But here's what nobody is connecting. The reason he couldn't answer it isn't just a political story. It's a story about who pays the price when the answer is missing. If anyone in your family has faced cancer or Alzheimer's or diabetes, or if you're worried about the next pandemic that's already starting to arrive, you need to hear what happened in that room. May 21st, 2026, Senate hearing room. Jay Bhattacharya sits at a long table in front of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, there to defend the FY27 budget request for the National Institutes of Health. He's been NIH director for 14 months. He's also been simultaneously serving as acting director of the CDC since February, 2 full-time jobs, 1 person. And Senator Patty Murray of Washington, the vice chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, has a question. She doesn't start with pleasantries. The NIH funding level is not just a number on a page. It really determines how much we can fund opportunities to discover the next life-saving cures, whether it's for cancer or Alzheimer's or diabetes and so much more. Then she looks directly at him. Dr. Bhattacharya, how do you justify cutting NIH research by billions to send $500 billion more to the Pentagon? Do you personally support that? What he said next is the thing you won't see in the 30-second clip. Bhattacharya responded, "Senator, the budget is obviously a major problem for this country. The NIH, my job is to make sure that my colleagues have the resources they need to fund the best biomedical research in this country. And I am really grateful to work with Congress and the administration to make sure that that's possible." He didn't answer. Murray's response, 3 words, said everything. "You didn't really answer the question." Pause. And I know why. Think about what that exchange represents. At his confirmation hearing in March 2025, this same man told senators that dissent is the very essence of science, and that he would build an NIH committed to gold standard science and innovation. He promised to restore public trust in an agency that had, in his own words, presided over a culture of cover-up. 14 months later, asked the most direct question an NIH director can be asked, "Do you support the president's budget plan?" He cannot give an answer. The numbers behind Murray's question are straightforward. Trump's FY27 budget proposes cutting NIH by $5.75 billion, roughly 12%, bringing the agency from about $46.5 billion down to $41.5 billion. That cut would mean approximately 1,800 fewer new research grants funded. Fewer grants means fewer clinical trials. Fewer clinical trials means cancer treatments that don't get developed, Alzheimer's drugs that don't get tested, diabetes studies that don't complete. Murray put the trade-off plainly. This $6 billion cut is being made to help fund a $500 billion increase in Pentagon spending, pushing the total defense budget to $1.5 trillion. And as she pointed out, one independent estimate found it would take less than 2% of Trump's proposed war budget to prepare candidate vaccines against active viral diseases. He couldn't defend the trade-off. Wouldn't or couldn't. Same result. But here's what that dodge was sitting in front of. The $6 billion being proposed is only half of what's already gone, and the scope of what's already been removed from inside the NIH makes that $6 billion figure look almost understated. But buried inside everything that's gone, there's one number that belongs to a specific group of scientists, and we're going to get to it. Here's what was already true on the day of that hearing. Not proposed, not pending, already done. Since January 2025, the NIH had terminated $9.5 billion worth of research through more than 2,100 canceled grants. An additional $2.6 billion in contracts supporting clinical trials had been eliminated. Nearly 4,000 expert staff had left the agency. More than 1,000 infectious disease research grants, specifically, had been cut. $500 million in mRNA vaccine contracts, described by Murray as our best bet for rapidly developing a vaccine, had been terminated. And as of mid-May 2026, the NIH had spent only $10.09 billion of its $47 billion annual budget, compared to an average of $14.75 billion at the same point in prior years. The money was sitting there. It just wasn't going out. A survey of NIH-funded researchers, the scientists actually doing this work, found that 43% had already canceled planned research projects. About half had reduced the scope of their work. More than a quarter had laid off lab staff. Senator Dick Durbin mentioned at an earlier hearing that Northwestern University had not received a single penny in NIH grants in 11 consecutive weeks. At the time of the May 2026 hearing, 15 of the NIH's 27 institute directors were acting directors, not permanent, not confirmed, including the director of NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the person running America's premier infectious disease research institute, acting. Murray reported that 8 of NIAID's top 10 officials were no longer in their roles. Its acting director, Jeffrey Taubenberger, stepped down the morning of the hearing. Murray asked Bhattacharya how many clinical trials had been affected. He didn't have that number. How many fewer would be funded under the FY27 budget? He couldn't answer. Murray put her own count on it. At least 150 clinical trials terminated, including ones for HIV vaccines, ovarian cancer, and diabetes. Leadership vacuum. During an active hantavirus outbreak, during a concerning Ebola situation. And somewhere inside all of this, a specific group of scientists was no longer funded, a group that had been studying something, and the thing they were studying didn't stop just because the funding did. The Republican leading the committee overseeing all of this had seen enough, and what she said publicly is the part that keeps getting left out of the coverage. The Senate Appropriations Committee is run by a Republican. And that matters here, because when Trump's administration first proposed cutting the NIH by 40% for fiscal year 2026, from $46 billion down to $27.9 billion, it wasn't Democrats who led the response. The Republican chair of the full Appropriations Committee went on record calling that proposed cut, and I'm quoting directly, so disturbing, and warned it would undo years of congressional investment in NIH, and it would delay or stop effective treatments and cures. The full Senate Appropriations Committee then voted, bipartisan, to reject that 40% cut entirely. Instead of slashing $18 billion, they approved a $400 million increase. When the White House Office of Management and Budget later froze $15 billion of NIH's already appropriated FY 2025 budget, without warning, 14 Republican senators wrote an urgent letter to the OMB director demanding the money be released, warning that continued delays could threaten Americans' ability to access better treatments. 14 Republicans. Mitch McConnell signed that letter. Lindsey Graham, Lisa Murkowski, Bill Cassidy, who chairs the Senate HELP committee and who separately stated, if you want to control long-term healthcare costs, you've got to invest in basic research. The freeze was reversed the same evening, only after the bipartisan lobbying campaign. These senators weren't breaking with Trump on immigration or the border. They were breaking with him on the one issue where the math is hardest to argue with. When you cut the research budget, the diseases you were studying don't pause. The clinical trials that stop don't pick back up. The scientists who leave for other countries don't come home. The Republican chair who called the cuts so disturbing, the person whose job is to protect the president's spending priorities in the Senate. Her name is Susan Collins of Maine, Republican, chair of the most powerful spending committee in the United States Senate. Her position on the NIH cuts, on record, matches what Patty Murray has been saying. And that bipartisan convergence tells you something that the partisan framing of this hearing doesn't. This isn't Democrats crying about Republican cuts, it's the math. And the math is about to connect to something specific. Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Lisa Murkowski. 14 Republican senators writing emergency letters to protect NIH funding. A bipartisan committee vote to reject the cuts. The Republican help chair saying basic research is how you control healthcare costs. Now connect that to everything before it. Murray asked the question, and Bhattacharya couldn't answer it. The NIH already has $9.5 billion in terminated grants, 4,000 fewer staff, 15 acting directors. The Republican leading this committee calls it so disturbing, it would delay or stop effective treatments and cures. Here is one more thing Bhattacharya acknowledged at the earlier hearing. Some of the grant cancellations were done by word search. DOJ members searched grants for flagged terms like diversity and cut any that contained the word, including, he admitted, grants where diverse simply referred to recruiting varied clinical trial participants, not DEI programs, cancer trials attempting to include multiple ethnic populations. He said he'd set up an appeals process. He said he didn't take this job to terminate grants. But the grants were terminated. And the ones that stayed cut include a research group that was doing something very specific. Murray named it in the hearing. Quietly. No theatrics. Just a fact delivered into the record. And now here it is. Here it is. The fact J. Bhattacharya couldn't defend in that hearing room. Murray stated it plainly. You have even terminated NIAID, funding for a group that was studying the exact type of hantavirus that caused the deadly outbreak that we're dealing with right now. Not a similar hantavirus. Not a related strain. The specific hantavirus strain behind the active outbreak, the one that killed people aboard a cruise ship, the one that had 41 Americans under active monitoring at the time of that hearing, was being studied at NIAID. That team's funding was cut, and then the outbreak arrived. Trump's budget now asks Congress for $500 billion more for the Pentagon. So much that, by the White House's own admission, aides scrambled to figure out what the Pentagon could even do with that kind of increase. Meanwhile, Murray noted that it would take less than 2% of that war budget to fully prepare candidate vaccines against the active viral diseases currently threatening Americans. Less than 2%, for the research that could have mattered most. That's the picture you now have that most people watching the evening news last night don't have. You know that the Republican chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee called these cuts so disturbing. You know the bipartisan committee voted to protect NIH. You know the NIH director couldn't answer basic preparedness questions. And you know the one specific, concrete consequence that didn't make the headline: the hantavirus research team was defunded before the hantavirus killed people. The bottom line: the man the NIH tried to silence in 2020 is now running the NIH in 2026. Some of what he's doing has logic behind it. Some of it doesn't. And the part that doesn't is no longer abstract. It has a name. It has a strain. It has a ship. It has 41 people being monitored right now. When the research goes, the diseases don't wait. If this video gave you something the evening news didn't, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're not letting stories like this disappear into the news cycle. And drop a comment below. If you think this budget trade-off is the right call, make that case. If you had a family member in one of those canceled clinical trials, I want to hear that too. October 4th, 2020. A Stanford professor published 900 words that his own government tried to erase. May 21st, 2026. The man who wrote them couldn't answer a senator's question about what his agency did with the research that could have seen this coming. The question is still unanswered. It shouldn't stay that way.